Hello, Jim. Hello, James. How are you today?
Hey, Irene. Good, thanks.
Good.
Yeah, things are going well here. Thanks.
Very nice. So for our audience, I'm here today with James Taylor, who is a known data management expert. He's CEO and principal consultant in decision management solutions. And he's been a leading expert in decision management worldwide for a number of years now, I would say. So James, thank you so much for joining. And
Well,
Jim,
thanks for having me.
Good. And Jim Sinur is here. So Jim is a process guru. Jim is an author. Jim is an AI expert. Jim is a blogger, and Jim is an artist. So the latest blog we did with Jim is about his AI in art and music explorations. It's on top of being a technologist, guru, and author. So Jim, thanks very much. Thanks for joining.
Well, it's great. And James and I have had a history of working together, and I've watched his career and the knowledge that he's creating out in the marketplace to help clients, has been, something that I've paid a lot of attention to, frankly.
Exactly. I do too. So we're very lucky to have you both here today. Fantastic. So James, you've been recently into decision management turned digital. So I know some of the analytics call it digital decisioning. And please talk to us. What do you find in digital world that we haven't seen in decisions before? Where are we going with this?
Sure. So, I mean, the recent focus, obviously, a lot of companies are very focused on digital transformation, right? How do I digitize everything? Digitize my data, my channels, my customer interactions. And what we find is that one of the things they neglect often is the decision-making they have to digitize. So they end up with a digital process that's storing digital data and digitized documents that routes things to people, as a colleague of mine used to say, essentially as a digital manila file. And then someone has to decide, are they going to pay this claim, or what to say, or what letter to send? And so they're neglecting the decision-making elements of all of this. So they don't really get the full value of a digital transformation. So what we try to do is tie decision management, this idea of identifying, managing, and improving decision-making explicitly, and focus that on, well, how do you embed that in silicon? How do you digitize that decision-making? And so the value proposition then is to say, yes, the one last piece of your digital transformation is how do you digitize the decision-making that will drive your processes forward, drive your customer interactions, will let you personalize your customer interactions. And I've just, written a new book called Digital Decisioning, which is really trying to sort of tie everything we've learned the last 20 years in managing decisions and using rules and using analytics back to that theme of how do you digitize this decision-making.
So let's go back to the basic for those who may not familiar with word decisions, because it's everywhere and we're seeing decision making. So let's talk about what do you mean by decisions? I think I know the answer,
Right.
but please go.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. One challenge with the whole approach is, and one of the reasons for picking digital decisioning now as a phrase is that if you talk about decisions more generally, everyone goes to executive decisions. And there's a famous Peter Drucker quote. He said, there's a tendency to think that only executives make decisions, or that only executive decisions matter. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so we're not focused on that kind of decision making. That's not what we're trying to digitize. We're not trying to say, oh, you should replace your boardroom or your management team with digital decisioning. What we're focused on is high volume transactional decisions. What do I say to this customer right now? What set of discharge instructions should this patient get when they go home? Should I pay this claim or not? So very, very focused, repeatable, transactional decisions. So, we generally say it should be a decision about a single thing, a single customer, a single interaction, a single machine, a single transaction, and that you want to make repeatedly. You got to make it over and over again. You want to make it consistently, and you want to make it accurately. But you're going to have to digitize it if you're going to respond at the kind of pace and scale of a modern organization. You can't have, you can't hire 100,000 people to answer the phones, right? You've got to have ways to digitize these interactions.
Wonderful. Jim, would you like to add to this discussion we're having? Because I know your extensive background in decision and processes. There is a way to link both, I hope.
Yeah, and particularly when it comes to evolving decisions. So, I think James was talking about those operational decisions that we have to make every day to keep our profits up, to keep our costs down, keep our customers happy, all the things that are around our desired business outcomes. Now, in the digital world, things are changing faster. And consequently, the rules in and around these decisions can be more volatile. So what I'm trying to study is, do we allow algorithms, AI, help us make the changes in the rules and the models around decisions? And it's an interesting area to dig into, and I'm still digging into it, particularly when you get onto edge behavior, where you have distributed, in essence, signal points that your company's listening for that's on the edge. And that might be something like a chatbot listening to a customer for a white collar kind of world or a value chain world. It's obvious, when you're talking about smart cities, smart buildings, Industry 4.0, where there are actually devices on the edge. But the idea of, how do we allow the agility to be driven into the decisions when we believe that modeled decisions are extremely important, because you got to get it right. So it's kind of a toss-up question.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work with clients. Once you model a decision, and we use decision modeling a lot, right? So we always begin by trying to model out the decision so we know its structure. When you automate that, you gather data about how you made each piece of the decision. So if you break a decision down into pieces, I have a decision model on the flip chart there. If you break it down into pieces, when you make the decision, you record all those sub-decisions. And we already have clients who are putting that data on a dashboard so they can say, well, show me all the claims that were low waste, low fraud, and low complexity, but I didn't auto pay, because I'm curious why I didn't just pay them. What thresholds could I tinker with? How could I change that to pay more of them automatically? Well, at the moment, they're mostly doing that by visual inspection of that data. But we have clients who are starting to feed that data into machine learning algorithms. Which pieces of my decision-making, or which decisions that I make in this model, seem highly correlated with complaints or problems? How might I use an analytic algorithm to change the structure or the way I make decisions, at least to identify places I should go look at? So to Jim's point, we're starting to see this. It's an interesting question as to how automated you want that feedback loop to get, but it is certainly entirely practical. If you implement the decision making in a way that generates a rich data set, well, that data set becomes input to your whole feedback loop, and that really is starting to change how we have clients, claims teams making weekly changes to their claims approach. Every week they look at what happened last week, and every week they look at that data, and every week they change the rules and the thresholds and the analytics they're using to drive better results next week. Every week. Yeah. That's really changing the world.
Yeah, and we had the same thing when I worked at an insurance company. If a policy was under $1 million, we were gonna just jet underwrite it and say, let it go.
Right.
And then over time, that threshold went higher and higher as we became better at bolstering other rules in the system. So we were able to jet underwrite things at 1.5 million last time I was at that company. So you're right, things are changing, and you look at the data and you look at tightening other rules so that you can have the best efficiency.
Yeah, and it's really important. I mean, one of the things we found with this is that there are sort of two key requirements we found in this. I mean, there's obvious ones like using a technology like business rules management systems that let you manage the logic and stuff, right? But the two things we found is, firstly, it only works if the business users really feel they own the structure of the decision. So one of the reasons we like decision modeling is that we elicit it directly from the business owners. So we start literally with a blank whiteboard and say, so how do you decide? Not what do you want the system to do, or what are your rules, or what data do you need, but how do you decide? And they tell us, and then we build a decision model from that. And so now they feel like they own the structure of this algorithm, right? And that changes their whole interaction with everything, right? The second thing is, it's not about how much you get done the first time. Often, the client that makes weekly changes, their straight-through processing rate on day one was 8%, which was way lower than their target. And they were like, it's fine, because those are the 8% no one disagrees over. No argument about those 8%. So great, you started. And then every week they ticked it up. After, I think after 10 weeks, they were at 28%. And when I checked in with them last, after about 30 or 40 weeks, they were at 50%. Every week, just getting a little bit better. And that continuous improvement mindset is also critical. One of the things that kills these kinds of systems is this attempt to build one master algorithm that's going to do everything, or get all the rules in the system on the first day, because it just doesn't work. It's just not how decision making is. To Jim's point, it's an evolving space. It always changes, and you've got to be focused on the change, on the continuous improvement, and not on the what did I do on day one. And that's a big change for like IT departments and all sorts of people. It's a big difference.
You also mentioned, James, you mentioned business owner, right? So I want you to spell out business ownership in this entire initiative, because we don't want it to be IT. We want business people to own, right, the progress and results. So
yeah, I mean, we're very focused on this. It's like, people tell us, oh, we've got all the rules in an old system. We want to look at those first. And we're like, no, really, you don't. You want to talk to the people who know how you should be making this decision and find out how they think you should be making it, because that structures the decision in a way that resonates with them. I'll give you an example, right? We use decision modeling a lot. And, at the end of a consulting project, there's a presentation that I jokingly call the please give us the rest of the money presentation, right? It's the we've done everything, here's all the deliverables, please pay us, right? In these presentations, most of the time, we don't present the decision model. The client does. One of the client's own people presents the decision model to their bosses, because they've become really invested in how the decision model works. And, the people who are paying for the projects notice that, because they're like, you work for me and you understand this decision model really well and you like it, you own it. And that for us is an essential ingredient, because otherwise they don't really understand the rules. They can't see where the analytics are being applied. They don't understand what data you're generating out of the back end to analysis. And so in the end, they just start sending IT notes. Would you change this? Would you change that? And you don't want that. You want them engaged, right? And so that early engagement in the modeling is really important. They can't do it on their own. You need IT and analytics teams to participate. But if they don't end up owning the model, it's just not going to work.
James, this sounds a lot like low code, no code in a way, and they use some of the same justification for somebody that's not as sophisticated IT wise. So how do you interact with the low code, no code, and obviously modeling is a form of low code? Are you finding yourself partnering with those guys? What's going on there?
Once in a while, I would say that most of our customers tend to be big companies, and they're focused on very high transaction volume processes, right? Because we're looking at high volume decisions. And those tend not to be where they're deploying no-code, low-code tools. They tend to be using those more in management and in interaction tools. And we've done some. And what we find is when you get a decision, when we build these decision models, we don't presuppose automation. So often we end up with sub-decisions that are manual. You need a person to do this. And in those circumstances, well, now you have to start thinking about how do I tie those people into the decision making? So I can ask you to make this judgment, right? So I don't say, oh, I can't automate this policy underwriting, therefore tell me if you would underwrite it. I say, oh, I can't underwrite this policy because I need someone to inspect the premises and see if they're safe. So when you've inspected the premise, tell me if it's safe or not, or how safe it is, and I will then finish the underwriting for you, right? So you're not asking them to do the underwriting, you're asking them to do specific tasks in the underwriting. Well, at that point, then you start getting into business process and workflow and low code environments to sort of try and capture that input data, right? Because you don't want people just seeing the whole policy and saying yes or no at the end. You want to be able to capture their more granular decisions. And so there we have seen, and so in those mixed human automated decisions, there's a role for low code, no code tools to build essentially little UIs to say, there are 3 questions we need you to answer about this policy. So we'll pop it up on your mobile app while you're at the location, answer these 3 questions for us, and then press the big red button, and it will call the decision service, come back and say, you can tell this guy that we're going to underwrite him. Because we only needed to know those 3 things, and then we were ready. Everything else was in his application.
Great, great, Jim. So we kind of jump from, right, all the way, the big promise, right into adoption and delivery, okay? Can we step back a little bit, go back to digital transformation? Because I know it's a lot points to cover, all right? But I do want to talk to you and Jim about what is it, AI landscape, how is it changing decision management and processes today? And let me stop right here.
So the subtext of the book is digital decisioning, how to, using decision management to get business value from AI. And our observation about AI and machine learning is that you can divide it into sort of like 2 buckets. And there's some guys at Gartner, Jim's old stomping ground, who have done some good classification work. And I like to differentiate between the kind of AI that really focuses on user interaction, search, natural language processing, image recognition, things that make it easier to interact with your computers, and they're more sort of decision-making AI, things that like machine learning, neural nets, and so on, that like change how you make decisions or help you make decisions in silico, in digital decisions. And when you look at those technologies focused on decision-making with AI, what we find is that the way most people are being told to adopt these things has basically a 100% failure rate. They're told, take your data, analyze your data with these great algorithms, and then deploy the algorithms to change your business. Okay, that has essentially a 100% failure rate. You might as well pile that money up and set fire to it. At least you would be warm and it would look pretty. I mean, really, for a big company, it's a complete and utter waste of time. You have contracts, you have customer expectations, you have markets, you have a supply chain, you have all these fixed points. You can't throw them out just because the algorithm says it would be more efficient to do it differently. It's never about the algorithm. It's always about the organizational change and the impact. And so we're like, you have to do this backwards. You have to start by saying, what decision do you want to get better at? And you have to ask those people, well, what kinds of algorithms would help you get better at that? Of course, you can't ask them that exact question because they don't know how to answer that one, but you ask them questions that elicit that information from them. And then you tell the analytics team, okay, these guys are making this decision. Here's how they tell good ones from bad ones. And they think if you could predict any of these 4 or 5 things, that would help them make a better decision. Can you predict any of those? Here's the accuracy requirement that the user set for it. Here's the data that's available at the moment of decision. What can you do? And so you drive it backwards. You say, this is what I need. Can I build it? Not, hey, I'm really smart. I've got this great data and I built this great algorithm. You should use it. The second one just doesn't work.
I sense you gearing towards collaboration between human and machine over here. Do I sense it correctly?
Yes, that's a big part of it. One of the interesting things about this, what we find is that often the human interaction is different from what people expect. Everyone's mental model of augmenting humans with AI is the algorithms are going to do a certain amount of work, and then I'm going to present this information to you, and you are going to decide. This is almost never what we find is actually the best way to do it. Almost always, you can define how you want to decide algorithmically, but there are judgments and interactions that you need humans to make for you because they're too hard to automate or not possible. And so actually the human decisions are often, if you like, at the bottom of the model. They're like inputs to the algorithm. They're essential inputs, but they're inputs. So one of my favorite ones was a medical one we did. One of the decisions in the model was, does this patient look like he will survive surgery? And the IT guys are like, well, how are you going to automate that? And I'm like, I'm not going to automate that. I'm going to ask the surgeon to tell me. And they're like, well, why wouldn't you just make the recommendation without that piece of information and then let the surgeon override it if they thought you weren't going to survive? And before I could say anything, the surgeon says, well, because sometimes, even if I don't think you're going to survive, surgery is still the right option because you're dying now. So I can do surgery and maybe you won't die, or I can let you die, right? That's my 2 choices. So while it's an important consideration, it's not the overriding consideration. So we've become big proponents of saying, never allow overrides. Figure out why someone might override it, and then embed that judgment into the decision-making so that it becomes part of your decision-making. this idea that you're going to build a system that's kind of sort of okay-ish and then let people override it when it's stupid doesn't work. You have
Not
to like
in healthcare.
stop.
Not in healthcare for sure. It may be some less critical tasks. Okay. So, Jim, do you have your point of view on when decisions should be about algorithmic ones and when, yeah, people can still have a voice?
Well, I think what I've found in my experience is if you're trying to push the decision making from a high level professional down to somebody who's less qualified. So for instance, I worked on an underwriting system where the doctors were making too many decisions. It became very expensive. They're a scarce resource. Their time is scarce. And so what we tried to do was push down to the average underwriter or maybe even a specialist underwriter. So we had situations where we knew somebody, the potential insured, had double vision. And so there are 57 reasons for diplopia, and there are probably more since I worked on this problem. So the idea was to have the less qualified person ask for a series of tests or suggest, based on the data that's put in so far, that this may be because they drink wine. This may be because they wear glasses and the prescription's out of sorts. It may be that they have diplopia because they have high blood pressure, and there's some tests that we can take to make sure that it's not a high blood pressure induced diplopia. And so by pushing down and letting the machine assist that low-level underwriter, even though the underwriter really wasn't qualified to know the reason for the double vision. And so in that case, they're not making the decision until the machine assists them. And I think you can do it both ways. I think in critical decisions like James was talking about, you need that human first. In this case, the human was assisted, and then of course more tests were taken, and that was, more data was gathered, and the algorithm checked it again. And by that time, the underwriter was getting schooled on this particular person, and so they could have said, well, I really think that this is bad double vision.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, and what's interesting for us is we're starting to see some life underwriters. But yeah, life underwriting traditionally did these enormously long rules. Well, if you've got asthma and you use an inhaler and you've been hospitalized 3 times and you regularly miss work and you're buying this product, then we're going to increase the price of this product by X. And then there's another rule. Well, if you have essentially exactly the same set of conditions, but a different product. Yeah. So there's these huge lists of all these detailed rules. So it's a terrible system. We're starting to see a move to severity-based decision-making. So I decide how severe your asthma is. And then each product says, well, here's the impact of different levels of severity of asthma on my product, right? And what's interesting about that is it's very much that, it's sort of formalizing what Jim was talking about, except that we're starting to see people try and use machine learning and data from like Fitbits and your watch and so on, or third-party data sources to say, can I predict how severe you're likely to have asthma or how crazy your scuba diving is or whatever it might be. Once I've separated the assessment of severity from the underwriting, then I don't have to do predictive underwriting. I can do predictive severity. And that's a much not easier, but it's a much more straightforward task, and one that's a lot less threatening to the underwriters and the product designers and everything else. And it means you've got a consistent definition across all your products. So now I can say, hey, Jim, we think you've got severe this and mild that. So we can't give you the product you ordered, but we now know exactly what the price would be of all the other products we have, because they all use the same definitions of severity. And so there's, you're starting to see this sort of, once you think about it a little bit more structured, then you can also start to say, well, could we use machine learning and AI to drive a different kind of interaction? And that's the other thing we found about formalizing decisions, is that it does create much more concrete ways to identify the machine learning and AI that will help you.
Absolutely. And James, many people start talking about explainable AI. all right? Because we
Right.
want to trace our decisions. We want to know how we got to a certain point. So can you please explain what are the new promise and what's new failure when we're using AI appropriately or not appropriately? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so explainable AI is a hot topic at the moment, right? And as always with a hot topic, there's an enormous investment in technology to solve the problem, right? The challenge for us is that if you just have an AI algorithm and you build the AI algorithm and you make it explainable, and you go to the regulator or someone and say, hey, look, here's the algorithm, here's the score it produced, here's how it produced that score. They go, okay, that's good that you know. What did you do with the score? Oh, I don't know. I showed it to Jim. What did Jim do with the score? I don't know. I just showed it to Jim. I put it on his dashboard. So now he knew what that score was and he knew why it was the score. But what did he do with it? I don't know. Well, it's not going to work, right? It's not explainable AI if you can't say what you did with it. And so for us, we're like, if you want explainable AI, you have to embed it in an explainable decision, because you have to be able to say, this is how I use the score to decide how to treat you. And so we see a couple of things that come out of this sort of decisions first approach to machine learning and AI. One is, if you need the AI to be explainable or not. If all I'm doing with the AI algorithm is referring you to an underwriter, to a claims adjuster instead of auto paying you, I probably don't need to explain that, because I'm not rejecting you. I'm just having someone look at the claim, which I'm perfectly entitled to do, right? So, or I'm doing marketing, right? I don't necessarily need every algorithm to be explainable, but I can look at the role the algorithm has in the decision and say, oh, I'm going to need to explain that. And then I can integrate that explanation of the score with the explanation of the decision. And then you can say things like, well, show me all the loans that I declined because your risk score was too high, where your income was a significant factor in your risk score. Because the risk score explains itself. It knows when income was a significant factor in your risk score, and I know how I use the risk score. So now I can say, well, these are the claims we declined because you didn't make enough money. Because your income affected the risk score affected the decision. I can follow that chain of logic. And that's really where people are going to have to go, right? This idea that just explaining the algorithm is somehow going to solve all their problems is, I think, delusional. If the result of that algorithm is then wrapped in a bunch of Java code or C code or Python code or Scala or whatever it is, that's not going to cut it either. People are going to have to explain the decisions they made with the scores, as well as how they got the scores.
Good. So we're about to wrap up, actually. So you know what? I do want to finish with net of the three ways we understood how to proceed with digital transformation, with digital decisioning going forward. So we did talk a little bit about analytics here, analytics and operational decisions, how well people understand them and how sometimes they just misuse both concepts, right? We did talk about AI, and explainable AI is a big thing going forward. So what would be the summarized takeaway, James and Jim, from you, so we can leave our listeners and viewers with some actionable
right.
Mm-hmm.
So we find there are three critical success factors for digital decisioning, right? The first is you have to begin with the decision in mind. You have to put decisions first. You can't do this by analyzing processes, analyzing data, or anything else. There are good reasons to do those things, but you won't get digital decisioning unless you actually focus on decisions. That's the first one. The second one is that you have to be willing to mix and match your technologies, that there's no one technology that's going to solve all your digital decisioning problems. You need to use rules, you need to use machine learning, you're going to need to use descriptive analytics and diagnostic analytics. You've got to use a lot of different technologies, and each decision needs a different mix. So you've got to be willing to mix and match. So you can't be technology-led, you've got to be business problem-led. And then the third thing is just focus on continuous improvement. Our experience is you can't get there in one go. You've really got to be willing to try, get started, experiment, learn a little bit, gather some new data, improve your algorithms, change your rules, try again, do some more. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're simply not going to be able to adopt these technologies effectively. So three things: decisions first, mix and match, continuous improvement.
Where can our viewers get your book, James? You have it in front of you, right?
It's on Amazon. You can buy Kindle. There's a Kindle version. It's currently being translated into Chinese and Japanese. So if you want Chinese and Japanese, they'll be available at some point. I'm not entirely sure when. But it's available on Amazon pretty much everywhere, and as a paperback and in Kindle. So,
And
It's
we'll
easy to
put
buy.
the link. We'll put the link down this video. So absolutely. And Jim, what's your point of view? What would be 3 takeaways from your standpoint?
Well, I agree with James. I would add one modifier as I listen to him. I think in this doing decisions first, I think it's important to prioritize the decisions. And the ones that are linked to the outcomes that are most important to the organization, I think is a step that happens first, but then you follow James' 3 steps, and I think that's right. The other thing that I think is important also is not only do we improve these decisions, we have to point to how these decisions are linked to business outcomes.
Yeah.
And if a company wants a different outcome, they need to be able to point to the decisions that might impact it.
Right.
And, you know, we didn't bring this up, but there has to be some kind of repository involved with all of these decisions, so that you say, well, I really want to change this kind of a balance as an executive. Which decisions should I focus in on? And I know James has done some work in that area.
Perfect.
Absolutely, yeah, for
So
sure.
let's link additional resources here, blog post, Jim, and your book link, James, page over here. So we're absolutely ready for next conversations if we get comments and actually, good viewership for this recording. So thank you so much. Thank you. This is tremendous. I've learned a lot. Thank you. Thank you both very much.
Well, thanks, Irene. Nice to see you again, Jim.
Yeah, nice to see you, James. You're looking healthy.
Looking good, everyone. Yep.
Not dead yet. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.